Jak and Daxter, a series that needs no introduction. Even if I'd never mentioned it, chances are good that a significant portion of people within the sound of my voice know of it. Of all the current PlayStation franchises that are laying dormant, this is probably the one with the most fans and the highest profile. Which is why my next statement might blow your minds. I don't like Jak and Daxter much, I really don't. I think this series balances out as okay, but it could have been so much better. This was reinforced recently when I went back and replayed the trilogy for the first time since 2013. At the time, I also thought the Jak and Daxter series was okay. The first game I found kinda dull, but I was kinda going off collectathons at the time, so I would think that. The second game was much better, but had some pretty hefty downfalls, and I found Jak 3 to be the overall most well-rounded experience. But however many years combined with a fresh perspective has not done this series any favors. Things have changed big time. Now, this should go without saying, but I want to assure you that everything I'm about to say about Jak and Daxter is not because I hate the series or have some vendetta against it, or God forbid, I'm an Xbox fanboy or something. I just wish this series could have been better, and with the benefit of hindsight we can examine why the series was, maybe if not the worst series Naughty Dog made, at least the most messy. After I played through these games, I was thinking to myself, what happened? Why didn't these games click? And then it dawned on me. Every single one of the trilogy's flaws can be traced back to one central issue. Naughty Dog had no idea what they wanted Jak and Daxter to be, or rather they did at first but completely lost the plot. And as such, the series ended up having absolutely no identity and no driving concept to build around. Now, believe it or not, I need to digress for a bit before I can get to my ultimate point, so time for a patented YouTube video essay digression! Back in the mid to late 90s, Naughty Dog was on top of the world. They went from Way of the Warrior to making PlayStation's biggest franchise in a matter of months, and in a short amount of time, Crash Bandicoot had supplanted Sonic as the de facto main rival to Mario in the video game arms race. Not to rip from today's headlines or anything. But it was clear from the beginning that Naughty Dog's strengths lied in the technical. They could make utterly polished or refined experiences, but their games would be lacking pretty much in every other aspect of presentation. However, in this era, that was fine. You weren't exactly going to Crash Bandicoot for a well-realized story or groundbreaking experimentation. You were playing them for the pure refined gameplay experience first and everything however good or bad second. Again, not to say that's a bad thing. Crash did what it did insanely well. The Naughty Dog Crash Bandicoot games are still considered classics to this day because they did what was expected of them, for the time, pretty much flawlessly. Plus, they're still just as fun to play now as the day they were released. In addition, the absence of the things people might expect more of today doesn't make the Crash games any worse for not having them. But it was telling that Crash's stablemate Spyro the Dragon by Insomniac Games pretty much pantsed Crash in every non-technical aspect of presentation. You can argue about which is the best series in terms of gameplay. I can, and indeed have, seen both sides of the argument, but I don't think there's any argument that Spyro had more modern presentation, which was an indication that in spite of being light years ahead of the curve in terms of gameplay design and engine programming, Naughty Dog was maybe a bit behind the curve in most other areas and needed a bit of a kick in the pants to get them up to speed. And them being behind the curve as video games evolved begot their next game, which leads us into the 6th generation of consoles. Games were getting grander and more complex, and pretty much any vision within reason could be realized, with new groundbreaking things being done with games pretty much all the time. So with that quantum leap in technology, Naughty Dog made a glorified 5th gen collectathon with some 6th gen sensibilities. That's not to say I don't like the precursor legacy. As I said, I kinda found it dull when I first played it. At the time, like any teenager, I was really only interested in the newest, hottest shit. But now, with the benefit of hindsight, I have a much more positive outlook on Jak and Daxter, the precursor legacy. More than anything, it was the only mainline Jak and Daxter game that knew exactly what it wanted to be, and as such was able to accentuate the overall package by building itself to complement the gameplay. It was a traditional 3D collectathon with open-ended level design, and every aspect of the design complemented the collectathon gameplay. So it was a success in that regard, and of the big 3 PlayStation franchises at the time, it was probably the most polished experience right from the off, with tight refined game design and level design. Not to mention, it was absolutely gorgeous looking, both in terms of graphics and animation. Animation was always one of Naughty Dog's biggest strengths after all. It was a safe game, but it was well made. However, the game's own gameplay design ended up being its biggest problem to a larger audience. How do I know this?
And like literally overnight, everything changed. We had already started working on Jak 2, and I remember doing a focus group and 2 8-year-olds were in this focus group. And I was like, so what do you think? And they acted like 16-year-olds, like 8-year-olds. Well, the graphics are good, and we really like the gameplay. We like what you're doing and the expansion of the universe. Really, this would be a fantastic game for our little brothers. And you're like, you're 8. What are you playing? Grand Theft Auto.
Yeah.
And it just changed everything.
Jak and Daxter, the precursor legacy, and 3D platformer collectathons in general were considered too kiddie for kids in 2001. Their target audience wanted something a bit more edgy, a bit more mature, a bit more adult. So why the sudden change from the previous generation, a generation where 3D collectathons did so well? Well, 2001 saw the release of a game that changed everything. Grand Theft Auto 3. GTA 3 was one of the most controversial games of its day. It became a hot-button topic amongst parents groups and anti-video game lobbyists who saw the game as some sort of cop-killing simulator and wanted it banned lest it poison the minds of our youth. Grand Theft Auto was always controversial, but the controversy was kicked into overdrive with 3 because of the game's groundbreaking realism for 2001. Suddenly, you weren't up in the sky far away from the action, which was bad enough, you were practically a real dude doing crime on the ground level. The resulting controversy bolstered Grand Theft Auto 3's profile tenfold. And as a result, the game became the holy grail amongst people who wanted to openly defy the cultural sticklers who wanted to control our constitutional rights to play video games, so the controversy ended up making GTA 3 practically print money. And as ever, trends amongst adults influenced trends amongst kids. Suddenly, kids, even young kids, didn't want to play those kiddie platformers anymore. Those were for babies, was the common consensus. GTA 3 becoming the holy grail amongst older gamers made it the holy grail amongst kids as well. It was the quintessential cool kids game. So with that, the entire industry took note. Everyone wanted to make the next Grand Theft Auto, nobody wanted to make the next Crash Bandicoot, and the market shifted as most customers wanted more games like Grand Theft Auto. That's why, in spite of all the good design, Jak and Daxter the precursor legacy was never going to do exceedingly well. It came out too late, at a time when games like it were no longer viable the same way they were just a few years earlier. The target audience was looking for something a little bit more mature, and games in general were shifting towards a more adult focus, so Naughty Dog took note. They had to make something to capitalize on the market's desire for GTA-style games.
Of course we could do more with Jak and Daxter. Well, let's continue the series, and that's why, if you look, Jak 2 he had a gun, he kind of cursed, like he did all the things that we were like trying to grab onto as much of the world as we could.
And that is what begot Naughty Dog's biggest mistake. Instead of A, continuing bold as brass with a build it and they will come attitude, or B, starting from scratch, they instead went with option C. Try and fit their already established game engine into an entirely different style of gameplay and jarringly shift the tone in a misguided attempt to age with its audience. And so they did, and the result was Jak 2, a divisive game to be sure. You can argue about whether or not this game is good or whether or not it's better than the first game. Personally, I think it's okay, but it had the potential to be so much better. I find that it's a massive step down from the first game. One of the biggest issues is that it took the already rather polished design of the first game and cluttered it to high heaven. The usual formula with trilogies goes like this. The first game is just a thing that's made. Then the sequel is where you fix all the problems with the concept, and the third game is usually when you get to polish the experience. Whether or not that happens is taken on a case-by-case basis, but the point is, Jak 2 was such a departure that it might as well have been a different series. I do think that some change was necessary because there weren't many places you could have taken the series from the first game, but this was too far. Jak 2 tried to take the sensibilities and mechanics of a 3D platformer collectathon and squeeze them into a GTA-style sandbox, then on top of that add gunplay, driving, and about 12 different minigames. Hindsight should be 20/20 when it comes to sequels, but Jak 2 just creates a whole host of problems because it's not using hindsight. So what were those problems that this vast departure caused? Well, you have an unbalanced health system where you can only take a few hits and you have like 100 people all around you shooting at you at any given time. It's not a hard game per se, it's just way too easy to die. All because they carried over a health system that worked for a 3D platformer with light combat into a GTA-style sandbox. But that health system does not work if you're making a game with a much more aggressive gameplay style. Combine that with a very unforgivably rare checkpoint system, and it makes for an experience that, unless you get really psychotically used to it, you're gonna end up repeating the same sections a lot. You also have unforgiving ammo balance, which means you're going to be running out of useful ammo really often, necessitating grinding for ammo between or sometimes during missions. Almost like forcing gunplay into an already established gameplay engine that didn't previously have gunplay needs a lot of tweaking and refinement, but because they just plopped it into the second game, they didn't have a chance to refine it. Finally, the vehicle's all handled like greasy buttock. It literally feels like you're on ice. The driving is generally fairly superfluous. You can get by just fine on foot most of the time, but the cars are also the quickest way to get around, so pick your poison really. And there are some missions that require you to drive around, and those missions are generally about as pleasant as a root canal. Now, of course there were similar vehicles in the first game, but those worked as a set-piece minigame in a platformer collectathon, but it doesn't work as one of the primary elements of an action sandbox game when you transfer it from one to the other completely unchanged. The handling of the vehicles that you're getting around with in a sandbox is one of the most important parts of the game. Then there's the repetition. You could cut out 90% of the missions and nothing would change as far as the overall relevant structure goes, which wouldn't matter if you didn't have to keep traipsing back to the same 4 or 5 designated questing areas over and over. This game is honestly one of the most egregiously repetitive games I've ever played. All of these things would be problems that would have been obvious if they had the benefit of hindsight, but they didn't have the benefit of hindsight because this game is such a radical departure from what they made before that it might as well be a completely different game in a completely different series. All of this serving to depolish and clutter something that could have been improved upon but was already as good as it needed to be. Doing so all for the purposes of chasing trends without grasping the subtleties, which begets the most divisive aspect of the game, the story. Whatever charm the first game had was gone in the name of making things dark and edgy. And I mean edgy. This is the game that starts with Jak being tortured for 2 years straight. This could have worked if they built to it, you know, subtly and naturally shifting the tone over the course of the game, but the tone shift is like a frying pan to the mush and just comes across as forcibly, laughably edgelord. The story had some good ideas and decent execution throughout, but the framing device is beyond jarring. Overall, as I said, I think this game is okay, but it's severely unpolished. A lot of that comes from just not knowing what it wants to be. It wants to be like Grand Theft Auto, but still carries a lot of sensibilities from back when it was a 3D platformer. There's no easy answer to the question, where does Jak and Daxter go after the first game, because there really was nowhere obvious for them to go in that direction. It was a creative brick wall in a lot of ways, but whatever the answer to that question was, they could have come up with a better answer than scorch the earth and try again. But in my opinion, the worst thing that Jak 2 did to the Jak and Daxter series as a whole was it made the question, what is Jak and Daxter, a trick question? Which brings us to Jak 3, and let me tell you, the misguided nature of the series did not stop with 2. In fact, I think it only got worse. Much worse. The third game carries the stench of the developers not having any idea what they were doing anymore, making for one of the most schizophrenic and messy games I've seen. It seemed the message had reached them, that they may have gone too far in a few places and corrected course to bring back some of the aspects from the first game that made it work, in particular the lightheartedness. Problem is, they still tried to have the same level of epicness and drama that the second game went for, which just made for a complete and total tonal whiplash. You have a dramatic death scene one moment, and then the very next scene is a comedy scene where it's revealed that the precursors are actually Ottsels. Then you have one scene where a self-referential joke shares space with a character telling you why the world might be ending. The tone is all over the place, and the writing is even more all over the place. Like how the game starts with Jak being banished because Ashlyn didn't have the power to overrule the Grand Council, and in particular Vigor, in an unforgivably contrived intro cutscene, but then Jak is back in the city within a few hours like it's nothing. Then later, Ashlyn suddenly has the power to disband the Grand Council and strip Vigor of his powers. Then later still, Vigor himself, the main antagonist for most of the story, goes on to be punked out and suddenly gets supplanted as the primary antagonist by some random guy we already punked out in the second game, only now he's a cyborg, which once again really goes to show their lack of understanding of what they wanted this game to be, that they couldn't even decide on an antagonist until the 11th hour, and it ended up being a minor character from the second game that had all of 3 minutes of screen time in the third game before he became the main antagonist. I had to look up who this guy even was because he was such an afterthought in the second game that I utterly forgot he existed. Like, he was taken out like nothing and was shown to be an absolute chump in the end, but now I'm supposed to take him seriously as the main villain? That's like trying to take Mark Marrow seriously after he was punked out by Sable for weeks on end. They really just had no idea what they were doing at this point. It's not just all over the map, it's off the map completely. I could go on for point after point, but there's one part that I really want to highlight. Kira was easily the best character in the first game. She was fiery, she was spunky, she was just a fun character that played a vital role in the game. But by the third game, she's relegated to being a bit player, being visible in maybe 3 cutscenes. All in favor of shacking Jak up with Ashlyn, the most boring love interest in the history of gaming. Slight exaggeration. Which is really just a microcosm of the entire series. They took what worked in the first game and gradually stripped it out until what worked is such a small aspect of the game that it's almost entirely non-existent in favor of poorly thought out dross. As for the gameplay, well, it's just as repetitive as the second game, having you go back to the same few questing zones multiple times, but at least they managed to iron out some, keyword some, of the balance issues from the last game. Most of all meaning that it's much less easy to die. You even have the ability to self-heal with the new light eco powers, but they also decided to focus heavily on car combat of all things. So once again, in lieu of building off what they already had, they decided to have something completely different be the primary focus. Hover cars were a thing in the last game, but this is full tilt dune buggy combat racing with multiple variations of cars with their own strengths and weaknesses, so we went from a solid 3D platformer to Grand Theft Auto to Jak 3 Fury Road. Beyond that, there's a very messy buckshot design sensibility to the mission structure where it seems every mission had a gameplay style that was completely unrelated to the last. During the first hour of gameplay, you go from arena combat to a rhythm game, to racing, to lizardback riding, to vehicular combat, to a turret defense game, and you repeat this pattern until the 2 or so hour mark when you finally get to the first platforming section. The very thing this series is ostensibly built upon, and it takes over 2 hours of unrelated game modes to get there. And it's not like you're playing each of these game modes once. Oh no, you have to play most of them a couple of times each before you can earn the privilege of getting to the thing this series is apparently built upon. But to Jak 3's credit, the main connecting gameplay at least followed on from Jak 2 and more or less built on top of what that game had to offer. But on that note, well, the first game was maybe a bit bland and the second game severely lacked polish, but Jak 3 was honestly one of the most boring games I've played in a hot minute. It was one of those games where I had to play it in hour-long chunks because I just found the experience so draining. I can blame a lot of things for that, but if I had to narrow it down, I think it comes down to the very thing that's so perfectly encapsulated by the first hour of gameplay. Jak 3 tries to be something like 10 different games and doesn't excel at being any of them. It tries to be a shooter, a sandbox game, a platformer, a racer, a brawler, a car combat game, a collectathon, and so on. 100 mediocre experiences does not a good experience make, and therein lies the primary issue that haunted Jak and Daxter from its inception. From the starting point of being a solid, polished platformer collectathon, the series found itself trying to play catch-up with the rest of the gaming industry because Naughty Dog was so afraid of letting their own franchise stand up on what it did well and wanted to chase this hypothetical audience that it could have had if they followed what was popular. It tried to keep correcting course to follow trends, tried to follow what people thought was good, and the end result was an absolute mess. They botched it until by the third game, the series ended up being a chaotic hodgepodge of barely connected gameplay styles as opposed to one cohesive whole. It's one of the most messy, inconsistent series I've played in a very long time, and it's the type of series that wants to have any identity but its own. Furthermore, obviously while this isn't indicative of overall quality, a good indication of well thought out design is the ability to explain a game or an entire franchise in a single sentence or two. For example, Jak and Daxter's contemporary Ratchet & Clank can be pretty easily described. A short cat-like creature uses an assortment of weapons to blow through various aliens on various planets in order to collect currency to buy more weapons to blow through more enemies and complete objectives. Platforming is also involved at times. Or let's take something like Spyro. A small purple dragon and sometimes his friends go around various worlds to solve issues by collecting various items and defeating enemies, usually with a flame attack and a charge attack. I honestly don't think you could realistically summarize what Jak and Daxter is as a whole with a sentence, because the series is so inconsistent that it doesn't really have a central identity. The answer to the question of what is Jak and Daxter, well, it's so nebulous that the answer basically doesn't exist. It's not necessarily the issue in itself, but it's the core reason for all the further issues, because a lack of design philosophy leads to complete anarchy of design. The inconsistencies, the lack of polish, the degradation of a simple formula into a chaotic mess of barely connected game modes, all of these can be traced back to the fact that after a while they didn't know what they wanted the series to be. Jak and Daxter is a series without an identity. When I think about Jak and Daxter as a series, I think about a series that was a follower, not a leader. While his contemporary PlayStation franchises, Ratchet, Sly, and especially God of War, were setting trends, Jak was cutting off its legs to follow trends. While Ratchet, Sly, and especially God of War were defining an era, Jak and Daxter was indecisively changing what it was to fit with the times, and as such, it's the one series of the four with no distinct identity. It's almost to the point that I don't even consider these games a trilogy. They're three individual games that are connected in name only. The unofficial Jak 4 is the racing spin-off Jak X Racing. It has a lot of parallels to Crash Team Racing. They're both the fourth game in their respective series made by Naughty Dog, and they're both racing games, but the difference is that Crash Bandicoot had such a clearly defined gameplay formula that Crash Team Racing felt like a true subversion, and in being subversive, they were able to use imagery and characters from throughout the series to give the game a feeling of a tribute to everything we'd seen, so they could celebrate the series before the doors were closed shut on Naughty Dog's time with Crash Bandicoot forever. Where because the question of what is Jak and Daxter doesn't really have an answer, Jak X Racing was honestly no more or less Jak and Daxter than any of the previous three games, so it didn't even have the luxury of feeling subversive, so it just felt like more standard fare. But at the very least, it buckled down and decided that it wanted to be a specific thing. It was named Combat Racing, and that's exactly what it was. So just from an objective standpoint, it's probably the second most polished game in the series next to the first game. And I will say this, even though it's not particularly relevant to my overall point. I had an entire bit here written and recorded about how I found this game to be boring, but that was working off of years old memories. After having replayed some of Jak X, I actually thought it was really solid. The driving felt good and weighty, it felt really satisfying to blow things up, and it had a lot more variety than I remembered it having. Aside from some balance issues like defensive items being basically useless, I thought this game was genuinely good, which really goes to show how much a coherent vision for design can help with overall quality. I'd probably place it as the second best game in the series, right behind the very first game, and maybe another one I'm about to discuss. Unfortunately, I have a PS2 Slim, so pretty early on into playing my save file corrupted, so sucks to be me. Now, here's the part where I'm probably going to say the most controversial thing I've said this entire time. I hear that people generally consider The Lost Frontier equivalent to an ovarian cyst, but honestly, I pretty much consider it on par with the latter parts of the series, maybe even slightly better. I'll pause for a moment so you can, pick your jaw back up off the floor. Does it have issues? Well, yeah, that goes without saying, but I mean, none of it was a deal breaker for me, especially considering what we were dealing with for the rest of the series. They got rid of most of the side characters and got the series away from Haven City, but I mean, none of that was Oscar-worthy to begin with. I didn't find any of the characters worth keeping because they really didn't have anything for me to latch onto. And hey, this meant that they were able to give Kira a somewhat significant role in the story again, so I'm all for that. Is the whole edge of the world thing dumb? Well, yeah, but it's not like it's directly contradicting anything that came before, so I can accept it. Is it stupid that Daxter falls into more dark eco and becomes a monster? Yes, and I can't defend that and won't defend that because I agree it was f***ing stupid. The Lost Frontier absolutely has its issues, but what does this game do that's so offensive that it has to be considered the black sheep of the franchise? Once again, this is all speaking from the point of view of someone who is just not impressed by the Jak and Daxter series as a whole. Maybe if you're a hardcore fan, you can point to 100 different things that makes The Lost Frontier a slap in the face, but speaking from a fairly neutral standpoint, these games just don't really do much for me, so The Lost Frontier is just more standard fare for me. As a series, I think that Jak and Daxter is really flawed, and it only got worse as it went on. The diminishing quality could have very easily been mitigated if Naughty Dog just sat down and decided, this is what we're gonna do regardless of if it succeeds or fails. And the ironic thing is, in ruining the series' quality by chasing trends, it really backfired. The law of diminishing returns caught up to Jak and Daxter really quick, and Jak X Racing is, and will probably forevermore be, the worst-selling Naughty Dog game after 1996. That is to say, since they became a developer worth a damn. And when you look at what Jak 4 was supposed to be, it didn't look very promising. They were apparently going to make it this gritty, realistic looking game, which looked god-awful. Once again, that just further proves my point. They had no idea what they wanted this series to be after a while. Now, I shouldn't have to keep saying this, but I really don't hate Jak and Daxter. I think it's probably my second favorite series that Naughty Dog has made, but for me it goes Crash Bandicoot, and then several miles below it goes Jak and Daxter, and then below that is The Last of Us, and finally Uncharted. Hell, I don't even hate Uncharted, I've always just found it entirely bland. But with that said, Uncharted and The Last of Us are at least polished and focused design-wise, regardless of my personal feelings on what those games did. Subjective enjoyment is all well and good, but as far as objective qualities, Jak and Daxter is the most inconsistent, unpolished, and repetitive thing that Naughty Dog made. But none of that was present in the first game. How they followed up on the first game was where all the issues arose. Crash Bandicoot was consistent, Uncharted was consistent, The Last of Us... well, that's a can of worms I'm not willing to open at this time. And once again, all of that can be traced back to one central issue. Jak and Daxter was a series without an identity. It wanted to have any identity but its own. It could have been so much more. They had the opportunity to make something truly great because they started out with something good veering into great. In spite of being known for setting trends, Naughty Dog showed the dangers of what can happen when you blindly follow trends. And honestly, if you were to ask me how I would fix these games assuming they ever get remade, well, I don't think you can fix them without making a completely different series of games. I know this is all probably sacrilege to some because I do know that Jak and Daxter is quite popular and quite well liked, but hey, that's just how I feel. If you like or love these games, more power to you. I wish I could like them as much as some people do. But I still don't hate the series. Even then, I have to put the caveat that I really enjoyed the first game and not so much the latter games. I have to make that distinction because saying that you like Jak and Daxter isn't a simple statement due to the fact that each game might as well be in a completely different series. Anyway, feel free to disagree with me, feel free to drop a comment and let me know why, but let's be civil here, people.